Margaret Brooks didn't cry when she found the divorce papers on her husband's desk. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply picked them up, read every word, folded them once, and set them down beside his inkwell like a woman returning a book she'd already finished. The other woman stood in the doorway watching, waiting for the tears that never came. Nathaniel waited too. What none of them understood, not yet, was that Margaret had been ready for this moment for 2 years. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow every step of Margaret's journey to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Virginia, July 1817. The summer had been brutal that year. The kind of heat that settled into the bones of a house and refused to leave, that turned the air thick and slow, that made tempers short and secrets shorter. The tobacco fields outside the Brooks estate had gone quiet by mid-afternoon each day, workers retreating to whatever shade they could find, and the big house itself seemed to hold its breath through the long golden hours between noon and dusk. Margaret Caldwell Brooks had learned to love those quiet hours. She had learned, in 6 years of marriage, to find her peace in the spaces Nathaniel didn't occupy. The early mornings before he rose, the late evenings after he retired, the long stretches of afternoon when he rode to town or hosted meetings she was never invited to attend. She had learned to build an entire life inside the margins of his, and she had learned to do it without ever letting him see how much she understood. That was her first mistake, she would later think. Not hiding it. Being too good at hiding it. She came back from the east pasture fence line earlier than expected that Tuesday afternoon. She had gone out to walk the boundary markers herself. Something she did quietly, without announcing it, because the estate surveyor had submitted numbers last month that didn't match what she knew from memory. 3 acres on the eastern edge had been quietly shifted in the documentation. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for Margaret to notice immediately. She had her riding gloves in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. Her own notes, written in her careful handwriting, recording the precise measurements she had paced herself that morning. She was already composing the letter she would send to the land registrar's office in Richmond. Already thinking 3 steps ahead, the way she always did, the way she had always had to. She came through the back entrance, the way she always did when she'd been walking the land. Down the long center hallway, past the portrait of Nathaniel's grandfather that she had always privately found imperious and cold, toward the staircase, planning to wash the dust from her hands before anyone saw her. That was when she heard the voices from the library. Not raised, not arguing. Calm, which was worse. She knew Caroline Whitmore's voice before she even reached the door. Everyone in Albemarle County knew Caroline Whitmore's voice. That particular soft, careful way she spoke, like every word had been rehearsed the night before for maximum impression. Margaret had heard it at church, at dinners, at the seasonal gatherings that Virginia's propertied families conducted with the same grim ritual precision as any military exercise. She had heard it, in recent months, considerably more often than felt comfortable. She stopped outside the library door, not to eavesdrop. She had never been a woman who needed to press her ear to doors. She observed, she calculated, she paid attention to things others dismissed. She stopped because something in the quality of the silence between their words told her that what was happening behind that door was not a social call. She pushed it open. Nathaniel stood at the center of the room with the particular posture he adopted when he believed himself to be in command of a situation. Shoulders squared, jaw set. The posture of a man who had decided something and expected the world to arrange itself accordingly. He was 35 years old, and he wore his authority the way some men wore expensive boots, conspicuously, and with the constant low-level anxiety of someone who'd borrowed them. Caroline Whitmore stood beside him. Close beside him. The kind of close that answered several questions Margaret had been politely declining to ask for the better part of a year. On the library desk, between them and the door, lay a document. Several pages, bound with a ribbon. Even from the doorway, she could read the heading. Petition for Dissolution of Marriage. The room went very still. Nathaniel's jaw moved first. Margaret, you weren't expected back until... Evidently, she said. Her voice came out steady. Even she was mildly surprised by that. Caroline's chin lifted slightly. There was something in her face that wasn't quite triumph, more like the careful arrangement of sympathy over something harder underneath. "Mrs. Brooks," she said, "I want you to know that Nathaniel and I have discussed this at considerable length, and we both felt—" "Miss Whitmore," Margaret said, "with respect, I wasn't speaking to you." The room went still again. She walked to the desk, set her riding gloves down beside the document, looked at it for a moment with the same calm attention she gave to land surveys and account ledgers. Nathaniel was watching her with an expression that had started as confidence and was slowly reorganizing itself into something less certain. "I expected," he said carefully, "that this would be difficult." "I'm certain you did," Margaret said. "Margaret, Nathaniel." She looked up at him then. "Before I say another word about any of this, I want you to answer me one question. Honestly, can you do that?" He hesitated. "Of course." "Do you know," she said, "what the outstanding balance is on the Hartwell loan?" Silence. "The one your father took in 1809, she continued. "Secured against the eastern acreage. Renegotiated twice since then. Once in 1813 and again in 1815. Do you know the current balance?" Nathaniel's expression shifted. "I don't see what that has to do with—" $4,218, Margaret said. "As of the 1st of this month. The Hartwell family is considering calling it in full. They've been in communication with a land agent in Richmond who has expressed interest in the eastern parcel specifically." She paused. "I've been managing that correspondence for 8 months." The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. Caroline turned her head slightly to look at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said nothing. "The Caldwell lease on the southern tobacco fields," Margaret continued, "which provides approximately 30% of this estate's annual income, is in my name, not yours. It was part of the arrangement my father made as a condition of our marriage, and it remains in my name under the terms of that agreement. I mention this because your attorney," she gestured toward the document, "either didn't know that or chose not to include it." Nathaniel's posture, which had been so carefully assembled when she walked in, was beginning to come undone. "Furthermore," Margaret said, "the household account at the Charlottesville Bank, which currently holds the operating funds for this estate through the end of the fiscal year, requires my signature for withdrawals above $50. That was my father's second condition. Again, your attorney may want to review his research." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the petition on the desk. "I'm not refusing to sign this," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not going to beg, I'm not going to perform for you, and I'm not going to make this into something theatrical. If you want a dissolution, Nathaniel, I will discuss it with you, like adults." She picked up the document, folded it once, and held it. "But we are going to discuss it accurately and fully, because there are a great many things inside this marriage that you do not understand." Nathaniel found his voice at last. "Margaret, I think you're—" "I am not upset," she said. "I want to be clear about that too. I am not standing here weeping or breaking things because I am not surprised. I have known for some time that you were considering this. I have spent that time making certain that I understood exactly what my position was before you chose to act." She set the document back down on the desk. "Now I suggest you ask Miss Whitmore to give us some privacy, and you and I will sit down and have the conversation we should have had considerably earlier." Caroline looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at the document. Then he looked at Margaret, and something crossed his face. Not guilt, not yet, but the first uncertain edge of the realization that he had walked into a room expecting one conversation and found himself in an entirely different one. "Caroline," he said quietly, "would you excuse us?" It was not a question. Caroline's chin moved slightly, and she gathered herself with the careful dignity of a woman who had rehearsed several different exits for this scene, and she chose the one that retained the most composure, and she left. The door closed behind her. Nathaniel sat down heavily in the chair behind his desk, which Margaret had always privately considered more throne than furniture, and for the first time in a long while, he looked less like a man sitting on a throne, and more like a man who had sat down hard and wasn't sure how to get back up. Margaret pulled the chair on the other side of the desk, the visitor's chair, The supplicant's chair. The chair she had sat in precisely twice before in 6 years of living in this house. And sat in it with her spine straight, and her hands folded in her lap, and her riding gloves still on the corner of the desk between them. "I want to understand something," she said. "And I'm asking you to be honest with me, because I think we're past the point where pretending serves either of us." She watched his face. "When did you decide I was unnecessary?" He opened his mouth. "Don't apologize yet," she said. "I didn't ask for an apology. I asked when." He looked at her for a long moment. And then, to his credit, the first credit she'd given him in quite some time, he didn't retreat into the polished deflections he typically employed in difficult conversations. He was quiet, and then he said, "I don't think it was a decision. I think it was gradual." "Tell me what that means." "I thought." He stopped, started again. "When we married, I thought I understood what our arrangement was. You would manage the household. I would manage the estate. I thought that was clear." "And who manages the household?" Margaret asked. "You do." "And who negotiated the alderman contract in the spring of 1814 when you were in Richmond for the session?" A pause. "You did." "Who identified the drainage problem in the Northfield before it became a loss?" Another pause. "Who renegotiated the mill lease when the Calhouns tried to increase their percentage?" Nathaniel said nothing. "Who has been corresponding with the Hartwell family for 8 months, keeping them from moving to legal action against this estate?" The silence this time had weight to it. "I managed the household," Margaret said. "I also managed a great many things that don't appear in that category. Because it was easier. Because you didn't ask. Because I understood that you had been raised to believe that a wife who demonstrated too much understanding of the business would be seen as a challenge rather than a resource. So I stayed behind the scenes, and I did what needed doing, and I let you believe that the estate ran on your decisions." She paused. "And now you've brought Miss Whitmore into this library and placed a petition on your desk. And I find myself wondering how much of what you believe you own is actually still standing because of the woman you're planning to replace." Nathaniel put his hands on the desk. He looked at them. He looked at her. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't," she said. "That's not the same as innocent." He looked up sharply. "You didn't know," she said again quietly, "because you didn't ask. Because you looked at me and you saw the category you had assigned to me: wife, household, social obligation. And you never looked past the category to the person. That is not something that happens to a man accidentally, Nathaniel. That is something he chooses, morning after morning, for 6 years." He was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, somewhere in the distance, a field hand called out something in the afternoon heat, and another voice answered, and then the quiet settled back down over the house like a heavy thing. "What do you want?" Nathaniel asked finally. "I want to know where we actually stand," Margaret said. "All of it. The debts, the contracts, the correspondence. I want us to sit at this desk with everything on the table, not the version you've been managing in your head, the actual reality. And then I want to know what you're proposing, in specific terms, and I want your attorney and my attorney present when we discuss it." "You have an attorney?" "I've had one for 4 months." Something moved through his expression. It might have been respect. It might have been something closer to fear. "Samuel Hayes," she said. "He was your father's attorney, actually, before yours replaced him. He has an excellent memory for the arrangements made at our marriage, and he has been very helpful." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. He looked like a man taking inventory of a room he thought he knew, and discovering that several of the walls were in different places than he remembered. "And Caroline?" he asked. "Miss Whitmore," Margaret said carefully, "is a grown woman who has made her choices. I don't have anything against her personally. I think she has been told a great many things about what this estate represents that may not entirely match the reality." She paused. "That is a conversation for the two of you." "Margaret, I told you not to apologize yet." He stopped. "When you have something specific to say to me," she said, "I'll hear it. But I've been listening to generalities for 6 years. I'm not interested in them anymore." She stood, retrieved her riding gloves from the corner of the desk. "Set up the meeting with both attorneys. I'd suggest within the week. The Hartwell matter needs attention regardless of everything else, and I'd rather not lose that acreage while we're sorting out our personal affairs." She was at the door before he spoke again. "You've been planning this," he said. Not accusing, wondering. She turned and looked at him. "I've been preparing," she said. "There's a difference. Planning implies I knew what you were going to do. Preparing means I understood that whatever happened, I intended to be ready for it." A pause. "I've been ready for this conversation, Nathaniel. I've been ready for it for 2 years." She left him there, in the chair behind his grandfather's desk, in the long afternoon light, with the petition on the table between them and the sound of the summer settling over everything. She went upstairs to her room. She washed her hands. She sat at the small writing desk by the window. Her desk, the one she had brought from her father's house, the one thing in this building that had always been entirely hers. And she opened the top drawer. Inside was a leather journal, not a diary. She had never kept a diary. What she had kept, methodically, for 6 years, was a record. Every contract, every letter, every decision she had made or influenced or prevented, every number, every conversation that had mattered, written down in her careful, even hand within 24 hours of its occurrence. She opened it to the most recent entry, read it over once, took a fresh page and began to write. July 14th, 1817. He showed me the papers today. As expected. He was surprised to find me unsurprised. Also as expected. What was not expected? Miss Whitmore's presence. I had anticipated he would handle this privately first. That he chose to have her present tells me something about where his confidence actually comes from, and where it may prove fragile. Samuel will need to review the Hartwell correspondence by Friday. If Nathaniel's people reach the Hartwells before Samuel does, we lose the advantage I've spent 8 months building. I am not angry. I want to record that clearly, because I think it will matter later when I look back on this. I am not angry. I am, for the first time in a considerable while, entirely awake. She set down her pen. Looked out the window at the fields she had walked that morning. The boundary markers she had measured herself. The acres that the ledgers were quietly trying to disappear. Downstairs, she could hear the faint sound of a door. The front door, she thought, which meant Caroline Whitmore had left the building. Good. She turned back to her journal. There was still a great deal to write. 3 floors below, in the library, Nathaniel Brooks sat very still and stared at the petition for dissolution of marriage on his desk. He had written it himself, mostly, or had told his attorney what to write, which amounted to the same thing in his understanding of how such arrangements worked. He had expected this afternoon to be unpleasant. He had steeled himself for tears, for accusations, for the kind of scene that women in his experience produced when confronted with news they didn't like. He had not prepared for this. He had not prepared for his wife to walk into the room and dismantle, in 12 calm minutes, every assumption he had carried into the conversation. He had not prepared for the knowledge that the estate, his estate, the land his grandfather had built, the property his father had almost lost, and he had believed himself to have restored, had been quietly, methodically, invisibly sustained by the woman he had spent 6 years walking past. The Hartwell loan. He knew about the Hartwell loan. Of course he did. He had not known, precisely, about the correspondence. He had simply assumed, that the matter was being managed. He had assumed, the way he had always assumed, that things were being managed. He pulled the petition toward him. He looked at it for a long time. Then he got up and went to find his own attorney, and for the first time in his adult life, he was not entirely certain what he was going to say when he got there. That evening, Caroline Whitmore sat in the parlor of her family's house on the edge of town and turned a teacup around in her fingers and thought about Margaret Brooks's face. She had expected many things. She had not expected calm. She had not expected that quiet, measured voice laying out numbers and contracts and the name of an attorney who had been retained 4 months ago. She wasn't surprised, Caroline said to the empty room. And then, more quietly, she wasn't surprised at all. She set the teacup down. She thought about the promises Nathaniel had made to her, the estate, the future, the life she had believed was being offered to her in good faith. She thought about the Eastern acreage, the Hartwell loan, the fact that a woman she had always privately dismissed as merely decorative had been managing a financial crisis for 8 months without anyone knowing. "Miss Whitmore," she startled. Her mother stood in the doorway, watching her with the particular expression mothers reserve for daughters they are worried about but will not say so directly. "You've been very quiet," her mother said. "I'm thinking," Caroline said. "About?" She looked at her teacup. "About what I actually know," she said, "versus what I've been told." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she came into the room and sat down across from her and folded her hands in her lap. "Tell me," she said. Caroline looked up, and for the first time in several months, she wasn't sure she had an answer. The next morning, Margaret was awake before the sun. She sat at her writing desk in the gray pre-dawn and composed a letter to Samuel Hayes, her attorney, in neat and precise language, laying out exactly what had happened the previous afternoon and exactly what she needed him to do next. She sealed it. She dressed without calling for help. She went downstairs to the kitchen, where the cook was already at work, and accepted a cup of strong coffee and exchanged a quiet good morning. Then she walked to the study, not the library, the smaller study off the back hallway, which Nathaniel rarely used, and she spread her records on the table and began working through the numbers she would need for the meeting she had told Nathaniel to arrange. She worked for 2 hours before she heard his footsteps in the hallway. He paused in the doorway. He looked at the papers. He looked at her. "You've been at this since dawn," he said. "I have." "Margaret, the Hartwell correspondence is in the green folder," she said, without looking up. "The mill lease renegotiation is in the blue one. If your attorney wants to understand what he's actually dealing with, those are where I'd suggest he start." Nathaniel didn't move for a moment. Then he came into the room, quietly, without the squared shoulders and set jaw of the afternoon before, and sat down across the table from her. "I owe you more than I knew," he said. She set down her pen, looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "You do." He looked at the folders on the table, at the journal open beside her, at the 6 years of careful work laid out between them in paper and ink and the early morning light. "I don't know," he said slowly, I don't know what to say to you that isn't inadequate." "Then don't say anything yet," she said. "Let's save the talking for when there's something specific to say. Right now, we have a Tuesday meeting to prepare for, and the Hartwell situation will not wait on our feelings about it." She picked up her pen again. "Pull that chair around to this side of the table. You need to understand what's in these folders before your attorney does, or we're going to spend half the meeting with him correcting your misunderstandings in front of Samuel, and that helps no one." A pause. "All right," Nathaniel said quietly. And he pulled the chair around to her side of the table, and he sat down beside her. And for the first time in 6 years of marriage, Margaret Caldwell Brooks explained to her husband exactly what had been keeping his estate alive. And he listened. He listened like a man who had walked into a house he thought he knew and discovered it was larger and older and built on a foundation he had never bothered to look at, and realized that the woman sitting beside him had been tending that foundation in the dark for years. She did not soften it for him. She did not make it easier than it was. She told him the truth, all of it. Numbers and contracts and letters and decisions, and the 3 times she had prevented the estate from sliding toward insolvency without ever telling him she was doing it. And when she finished, she closed the last folder and set her pen down and looked at him. "Now," she said, "ask me your questions." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the window, the morning was coming up gold and hot over the fields. Her fields, the fields she had walked and measured and fought for in her quiet, invisible way for 6 years. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Any of it." She was quiet for a moment. "Because you didn't ask," she said. "And because I understood, very early, that you would not have been grateful. You would have felt embarrassed. And an embarrassed man with pride to protect is a dangerous thing for a woman who needs that man's cooperation to do her work." She paused. "So I worked where I was allowed to work. And I protected what needed protecting. And I waited." "Waited for what?" She looked at him steadily. "For you to need to know," she said. He was quiet. The morning light came through the window and lay across the table and the papers between them. "I made a mistake," he said. "Several," she agreed. "Margaret, but so did I," she said. He looked up. "I made myself invisible," she said, "and I told myself it was strategy, and some of it was. But some of it was fear. Fear that if you saw me clearly, you would find me insufficient. And so I stayed in the margins, and I let you see what you expected to see, and I told myself that was wisdom." She paused. "It wasn't entirely wisdom. Some of it was simply not trusting myself to be seen." He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, which, Margaret thought, was probably accurate. "I'm not asking you to stay," he said. "I mean, I'm not. That's not what this is. I know I've lost the right to ask you for things." "You haven't lost the right to ask," she said. "You've lost the right to assume the answer is yes." She folded her hands on the table. "Let's get through the meeting. Let's get the Hartwell situation resolved, and then we'll talk about what comes next." She paused. "Honestly, all of it." He nodded slowly. The morning stretched out ahead of them, full of everything that needed to be said and everything that needed to be done. And Margaret Caldwell Brooks, who had managed this estate from the invisible edges of her husband's world for 6 years, picked up her pen and went back to work. This time, with his eyes open. The meeting with both attorneys was set for Thursday. That gave Margaret 2 days. She used every hour of them. Samuel Hayes arrived Wednesday morning on horseback, which was unusual for a man of 60 who had long since graduated to carriages, and the fact that he had ridden told Margaret everything she needed to know about how seriously he was taking the situation. He came through the back entrance at her specific request. She had no interest in staging a production for the household staff, who already had enough to whisper about. And she had coffee waiting and her folders already open on the study table by the time he sat down. He looked at the papers. He looked at her. He said, "How long have you had all of this in order?" "Most of it was always in order," she said. "I've been organizing it for presentation for the past 2 days." He picked up the Hartwell correspondence. Read through it. Set it down. Picked up the mill lease documentation. Read that too. When he finally looked up, there was something in his expression that was very close to admiration, though Samuel Hayes was not a man who offered admiration easily or often. "Margaret," he said, "do you understand what you have here?" "I believe so," she said. "Tell me if I've missed anything." "You haven't missed anything." He set the last folder down. "What you have is a 6-year record of material contribution to the operation and preservation of this estate. The Caldwell lease alone. The fact that it remains in your name, that your father had the foresight to insist on that, that is significant. Your attorney in a dissolution proceeding would—" "I'm not certain I want a dissolution," she said. Samuel looked at her carefully. "Then what do you want?" "I want the truth to be on the table," she said. "All of it. I want Nathaniel to understand what this estate actually is and who has actually been running it. And then I want to make a decision based on reality, not on the version of this marriage that exists in his head." "And Miss Whitmore?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Miss Whitmore is going to have to come to her own understanding of her situation," she said. "I can't do that for her." Samuel nodded slowly. "You know his attorney is going to argue that the household management, everything you've done, falls under the standard domestic duties of a wife, that it's not financially quantifiable." "Then we'll quantify it," Margaret said simply. "Starting with the Hartwell correspondence. Show me where in the standard domestic duties of a wife it says anything about managing a $4,000 loan against agricultural acreage." Samuel almost smiled. He picked up his pen. "Walk me through all of it from the beginning," he said. "Everything." She did. It took 4 hours. By the end of it, Samuel Hayes had filled 12 pages of notes in his small, precise handwriting, and he sat back in his chair and looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something fundamental. "I knew your father," he said. "Thomas Caldwell. I knew him for 30 years. He always said you were the sharpest mind he'd raised." "He had 3 children," Margaret said. The other two were boys, and yet, Samuel agreed. He gathered his notes. I'll be ready for Thursday. After he left, Margaret sat at the table for a while longer. The afternoon had grown heavy and hot the way Virginia afternoons did in July, pressing down on everything, and she could hear somewhere in the distance the sound of the field hands wrapping up the day's work. She thought about her father, about the morning she had ridden away from his farm to marry Nathaniel Brooks, and the way Thomas Caldwell had held her hand at the carriage door and said, very quietly, "Always know the numbers, Margaret. Whatever else they take from you, they cannot take the numbers if you keep them in your head." She had kept them in her head, and in her journal, and in 6 leather folders in the study that Nathaniel had never once opened. She closed the last folder and went upstairs to change for dinner, and she did not think about crying, because she was past the point where crying would have helped anything, and she had learned long ago that grief spent in the present was grief that couldn't be spent on what was actually coming. She would need it later. She had a feeling about that. Dinner that evening was the strangest meal of Margaret's marriage. Nathaniel sat across from her at the table where they had eaten together, mostly in silence, for 6 years, and he looked at her differently than he ever had before. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, quietly, without reacting, filing it away. He passed the bread before she asked. He asked if the coffee was strong enough. Small things. The kinds of small things that a man did when he was trying to say something he didn't yet have the words for. She let him try. "I spoke to my attorney today," he said. "I assumed you would. He had some questions about the Caldwell lease." "I imagine he did." Nathaniel set his fork down. "He told me something I didn't know," he said, "about the terms. When your father negotiated them." "Yes?" "He said that if there were a dissolution, and you retained the lease in your name, the income from the southern fields would leave the estate entirely." He paused. "He said that would be," he described it as catastrophic. "He's not wrong," Margaret said. "Why didn't you tell me that yesterday?" "Because yesterday you weren't ready to hear it," she said. "You were still standing next to Miss Whitmore thinking this was going to be a simple affair. I needed you to be sitting across from me at your own table, without an audience, before we talked about what simple means in this context." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're very calm," he said. "I've had 6 years of practice," she said. "And I've had 2 days of preparation." She looked at him steadily. "Are you asking me whether I've been this calm because I don't care? Or are you asking me because you're surprised I'm not performing for you?" He had the grace to look down at his plate. "The second one," he said. "I stopped performing about 3 years ago," she said. "You didn't notice." He absorbed that quietly. "What happens Thursday?" he said finally. "Thursday," she said. "We sit in a room with both attorneys and we put everything on the table. Every document, every contract, every number. And we look at it together, as adults, and we figure out what the actual situation is." She picked up her coffee. "And then we make decisions based on that, not based on what either of us would prefer to be true." "And what do you prefer to be true?" he asked. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "I prefer," she said carefully, "that the man I married had known me. The actual me, not the category he assigned me to. I prefer that 6 years of work had been seen while it was happening, instead of only becoming visible at the moment it became inconvenient to ignore." She set the cup down. "But what I prefer and what is true are 2 different things, Nathaniel. I stopped confusing those a long time ago. You might try it." He didn't answer. They finished the meal in the kind of quiet that was not comfortable but was, for the first time in a long while, at least honest. Thursday arrived the way important days often do. Unremarkably, no different in quality from any other July morning, the sun up early and already warm by 7. Margaret was dressed and at the study table with her folders before the household had properly woken, and she spent an hour going over everything one final time, not because she needed to, she had it memorized, but because the act of reviewing steadied her, gave her hands something to do while her mind organized itself for what was coming. Samuel arrived at 9. Nathaniel's attorney, a man named Garrett Tilson, who had the particular look of someone perpetually on the verge of delivering bad news, he considered himself to have no personal responsibility for, arrived at 9:15. Nathaniel came in at 9:20, and Margaret noted that he had dressed more carefully than usual, which meant he was nervous, which meant at least some part of what she'd said at dinner had settled into him. They arranged themselves around the study table. Samuel on her left, Tilson across from him, Nathaniel across from her. Tilson opened his leather case and produced a sheaf of documents, which he arranged with the self-important deliberateness of a man who has been paid to be impressive. "I think we all understand why we're here," he began. "The petition for dissolution, as submitted by my client, represents—" "Before we discuss the petition," Samuel said, in the mild and entirely immovable tone that Margaret had come to deeply appreciate about him, "we need to establish the accurate financial and legal status of the Brooks estate. I have documentation here that speaks directly to the question of Mrs. Brooks's material contribution to that estate over the past 6 years." Tilson looked at the folders Margaret had placed on the table. Then he looked at her. Something shifted in his professional expression, a small recalibration. "I don't see how that's—" "It's relevant," Samuel said, "because the petition your client has filed does not account for several significant legal and financial realities that materially affect the terms of any potential dissolution. Once we've reviewed them, I think we'll find that the conversation changes considerably." Nathaniel said nothing. He was watching Margaret. She didn't look at him. She opened the first folder. "Let's begin with the Caldwell lease," Samuel said. What followed was 2 hours of the most specific and technical and quietly devastating conversation Margaret had ever sat through, and she sat through all of it without expression, without drama, laying out the reality of 6 years, document by document, number by number, letter by letter. The mill lease renegotiation, the alderman contract, the drainage decision, the 3 critical moments in which her intervention had prevented serious financial loss. The 8 months of Hartwell correspondence, laid out in full, including 2 letters from the Hartwells themselves, expressing relief that Mrs. Brooks remained attentive to the matter. Tilson's professional expression went through several revisions as the morning went on. He had arrived expecting to manage a straightforward domestic situation. He was discovering, page by page, that he had misunderstood the territory entirely. Halfway through, he asked to take a break. Samuel agreed pleasantly. Tilson stepped out. Margaret refilled her coffee and did not look at Nathaniel, but she felt him looking at her. When Tilson came back in, he had the look of a man who had done rapid mathematics in a corridor and did not love the results. "I need to ask you," he said to Margaret directly, which was itself a change. He had been careful, up until that point, to address most things to the room rather than to her specifically. "The documentation regarding the Hartwell correspondence. Were you acting on your husband's behalf in these communications, or independently?" "I was acting on behalf of this estate," Margaret said. "Which is to say, on behalf of the family that lives in it and the workers who depend on it. My husband was unaware of the severity of the situation. I made a judgment that addressing it directly was preferable to waiting for it to become a crisis. Without his knowledge, with his general authority," she said, "as the manager of this household and its associated operations, I didn't act outside my role. I acted inside it more fully than he was aware." Tilson looked at his own documents, then at Samuel's, then at Nathaniel. Nathaniel had gone very still. "The Hartwell family," Tilson said slowly. "Would they be willing to speak to the nature of their correspondence with Mrs. Brooks?" "You'd have to ask them," Margaret said. "I expect they would. They've been appreciative of the management of the matter." Another silence. Then Nathaniel said quietly, "Garrett." Tilson looked at him. "Revise the petition," Nathaniel said. Everyone in the room went still. "Nathaniel," Tilson began. "Revise it," Nathaniel said again. There was something in his voice that hadn't been there before, not softness exactly, but the specific sound of a man removing a pretense he'd been carrying too long to remember picking up. Whatever the terms need to be to reflect the actual situation, the actual contribution, the actual value. That's what the petition should say. Not the version I handed you. Tilson stared at him. That's a significant change in— I know what it is, Nathaniel said. He looked at Margaret. I know what I've done. Margaret looked back at him. She said nothing. Samuel made a note. The meeting went on for another hour, and by the end of it, the original petition had been effectively set aside, and a new framework for discussion had been agreed on. One that started from an honest accounting of what the estate was and who had built it, and moved forward from there. When Tilson left, he had the look of a man who had come to do a simple job and left with considerably more to think about. Samuel stayed behind to collect his papers. Margaret walked him to the door. That went well, he said, which from Samuel Hayes was essentially a standing ovation. It went honestly, she said. I'll settle for that. He looked at her with the directness that she'd always valued in him. What do you want, Margaret? Not what's fair, not what's legal. What do you actually want to happen from here? She looked at the front door, closed behind Tilson. I want to stop managing from the shadows, she said. Whatever else happens, dissolution or otherwise, I want my name on what I've built. I want the work acknowledged. And I want to know that whatever comes next, I walked into it with my eyes open and my name on the paper. He nodded. I'll have a revised framework to you by Monday. He left. She went back inside. Nathaniel was still in the study. He hadn't moved from the table. He was sitting there with his hands folded on the surface of the wood, looking at the empty space where the folders had been. And he looked like a man who had been told that a house he'd believed he built himself had in fact been built around him, and was still working out what to do with that information. She stood in the doorway. You can say it, she said. He looked up. Whatever you're sitting here trying to figure out how to say, she said, you can say it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I don't know how I didn't see it. You didn't look. That's not— He stopped, reconsidered. That's exactly it, he said. That's exactly what it is. I didn't look. He turned his hands over on the table, looking at them like they belonged to someone else. I walked past you every day for 6 years, and I looked at you and I saw what I expected to see, and I never asked. No, she said. You didn't. Why didn't you demand it? He looked up. Your recognition. Why didn't you put it in front of me and say, this is what I've done. This is what it's worth. Why did you let me stay ignorant? She walked into the room and sat down across from him. She thought about the answer for a moment. The real answer, not the strategic one. Because the one time I tried, she said, in the first year of our marriage, the mill situation, the first one, before you handled it and it went wrong. I told you what I saw. I laid it out for you the way I laid it out today, clearly and simply, and you thanked me for my concern and told me you'd take care of it. He frowned. I remember the mill situation. It worked out. It worked out because I went behind you and corrected the decision you made after you told me you'd handle it, she said. Before it became a problem, you never knew. She paused. And I stood there after that and I thought, if I tell him what I did, he will feel humiliated. And a humiliated man will spend the next 2 years reminding me of my place. So I didn't tell him. She looked at him steadily. You trained me, Nathaniel. Not intentionally. But you trained me to stay invisible. The words landed in the room and sat there. He didn't look away from her this time. That was the worst thing I could have done to you, he said. It was one of several things on a list, she said. But yes, that one was significant. He put his head in his hands for a moment. Just a moment. Then he straightened, and he looked at her with something raw and undefended in his face that she had never seen there in 6 years of marriage. I am trying, he said, to understand if there is anything left, between us, that I haven't already destroyed. She was quiet for a long moment. I don't know yet, she said, and I'm not going to tell you something comforting just to fill the silence. I'm not asking for comfort. Good, she said, because what I'm going to tell you instead is this. If there is anything left, it won't be found by you sitting here and apologizing and me deciding to be merciful. What's left, if anything is, will be found by you actually becoming the man who deserves to know what I know. She paused. and I have no idea yet whether that man exists." He absorbed that. "How do I—" He stopped. "What does that look like?" "I have no idea," she said honestly. "I've never had a husband who tried before." He looked at her for a long time. "That's fair," he said. "It's accurate," she corrected. "Fair doesn't enter into it." The news traveled the way. News in small Virginia communities always traveled. Not quickly exactly, but inevitably, with the remorseless efficiency of water finding cracks. By the following Monday, the households that mattered in Albemarle County had heard some version of what had occurred in the Brooks study on Thursday. The versions varied considerably in their accuracy, but they shared a consistent core: that Margaret Brooks had walked into a dissolution meeting and produced documentation of estate management that had left both attorneys recalibrating their positions. Opinions divided sharply. "She had no business being involved in the financial matters at all," said Mrs. Fowler at the Tuesday gathering she hosted for women in the county. "A wife manages the household. The estate is a separate matter entirely. That's the arrangement." "The arrangement," said Martha Alderman, whose husband had signed one of the contracts Margaret had negotiated, "is that the Brooks estate has been solvent for 3 years, when by my husband's understanding it ought not to have been. Now we're finding out why. I'm not sure I understand what's improper about that." "It's the manner of it," Mrs. Fowler insisted. "All those secret records, all those letters written without his knowledge. It's not natural. A wife should not be conducting herself like an attorney." "She was conducting herself," Martha said mildly, "like someone who understood what was happening to the land her family's lease was tied to and took steps accordingly." The gathering moved on to other topics, as gatherings did, but the disagreement didn't resolve. It spread instead, the way disagreements about women's behavior always spread in county society, quietly, persistently, drawing lines that people were careful to step across only when they thought no one was watching. Margaret heard about it from her housekeeper, Mrs. Pryor, who reported these things without being asked, because she had worked for the Caldwell family before Margaret's marriage and maintained a fierce personal loyalty that manifested primarily as information delivery. "Mrs. Fowler's set is saying you overstepped," Mrs. Pryor said, with the tone of someone delivering a weather report on conditions they find personally offensive. "Mrs. Fowler's set would say that," Margaret said, without looking up from the letter she was composing. "Mrs. Alderman stood up for you." "Martha Alderman is a practical woman," Margaret said. "She understands numbers." "What do you want me to say if people ask me about it?" Margaret set her pen down. "Tell them the truth," she said. "Tell them I managed what needed managing. If they want to debate whether I should have, that's their right. But the managing happened. That part isn't debatable." Mrs. Pryor looked at her with an expression that had approval in it, which for Mrs. Pryor was essentially an embrace. She left, and Margaret went back to her letter. It was addressed to the Hartwell family. She was resolving the matter herself, cleanly and definitively, before Tilson's revised petition created any ambiguity about her authority to act. Samuel had confirmed that her legal position was sound. What remained was simply to exercise it. She finished the letter, sealed it, set it aside to go out with the Morning Post. Then she pulled a fresh sheet of paper and sat for a moment with her pen in her hand. What she had not told Samuel, what she had not told Nathaniel, what she had not written in her journal, was this: she was afraid. Not of the dissolution, not of the social opinion, not even of what came next. She was afraid that she had spent so many years being invisible that she had forgotten, somewhere in the long, disciplined middle of it, what it felt like to be seen. And that now that she was visible, truly visible for the first time, she would discover that she didn't know what to do with it. She had built herself for survival in the margins. She had been exceptional at it. The question that was beginning to trouble her, in the long, quiet hours when she couldn't sleep, was whether she knew how to exist in the center. Her father had always said she was the sharpest mind he'd raised. She had believed him when he said it. But there was a difference between being sharp in private, where sharpness was invisible and therefore safe, and being sharp in public, where it made people uncomfortable and invited the kind of resistance that Mrs. Fowler represented, and that whole communities could generate when they decided a woman had stepped outside the lines of what she was supposed to be. She stared at the blank paper. Then she thought of something her father had also said, on a different morning, in a different context, when she had been 17 and afraid of something she couldn't quite name. Margaret, the only way to find out if you can do a thing is to do it. Being afraid of the answer is not the same as the answer being no. She put pen to paper and began to write. Caroline Whitmore came to the house on Wednesday. Margaret was in the garden, the kitchen garden, not the ornamental one, the one she actually tended herself, where she could think, when Mrs. Pryor appeared at the gate with an expression that communicated the identity of the visitor without requiring words. "Tell her I'll be in 5 minutes," Margaret said. She finished what she was doing, washed her hands at the pump, went inside. Caroline was in the front parlor, standing rather than sitting, which Margaret took as either nervousness or the decision that sitting would feel too much like staying. She was dressed carefully, as she always was, but there was something different in her face, a quality of resolution, or maybe of someone who had been thinking very hard for several days and had arrived at a conclusion they weren't entirely comfortable with. "Mrs. Brooks," she said. "Miss Whitmore," Margaret said. She did not invite her to sit. She did not offer coffee. She simply stood and waited and let Caroline find her own way to whatever she'd come to say. "I owe you an apology," Caroline said. "You don't owe me anything," Margaret said, which was not absolution and was not dismissal. It was simply accurate. "I think I do." Caroline's voice was steadier than Margaret had expected. "I came into this. I believed what I was told. About the estate. About what it was, what it meant, what Nathaniel, what he could offer." She stopped. Looked him at the wall for a moment, then back at Margaret. "I didn't ask the right questions, because I didn't want the answers to change what I wanted to believe." "That's a very human thing," Margaret said. "It's a convenient thing," Caroline said, "and I'm not interested in convenient anymore." She straightened. "I want you to know that I intend to remove myself from this situation completely. Not because anyone has asked me to. Because I've looked at what I've been a part of, and I don't want to be that." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Caroline looked slightly surprised that Margaret had asked. "I'm going back to Philadelphia," she said. "My mother has family there. There are prospects that don't require me to build myself on top of someone else's foundation." "That's a good way to put it," Margaret said. "It came to me when I was thinking about you," Caroline said. "About what you'd built here. Within, the terms of what you were given." She paused. "I want to build my own thing. I want my name on it." Something moved in Margaret's chest. Not generosity exactly. She wasn't there yet. But something that was at least the beginning of recognition. "Then go to Philadelphia," she said. "And don't let anyone put you in the margins." Caroline looked at her. "You either," she said. She left with her composure intact and her head up, and Margaret watched her go and stood in the doorway of the parlor for a while afterward, turning that last exchange over in her mind. She hadn't expected to feel anything like solidarity with Caroline Whitmore. She filed the surprise away with everything else and went back to work. That evening, Nathaniel knocked on the door of the study where she was working. "Come in," she said. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which he hadn't done since the first year of their marriage, when he had been occasionally uncertain how to present himself to her, and the hat had been something to do with his hands. She noticed it without commenting on it. "Caroline came today," she said. "I assume you know. She told me last night," he said, "that she was removing herself from everything." "I know. Are you?" He stopped. "How do you feel about that?" "I feel that she made the right decision for herself," Margaret said. "That's all I feel." He came into the room then, not invited, but not unwelcome, and sat in the chair across from her desk, the visitor's chair. The chair he'd sat in after that first long morning when she'd shown him everything. It seemed to be becoming his chair in this room. She wasn't sure yet whether that was a good thing. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said, about becoming the man who deserves to know what you know." He paused. "I want to try." She looked at him steadily. "I know that doesn't mean anything by itself," he said. "I know that saying a thing and doing a thing are completely different," she said. "Yes." He held her gaze. "I know that. What I want to ask is, what would that actually look like? What would you need to see for it to mean something real?" She was quiet for a moment, genuinely thinking. "Start with the Hartwell matter," she said. "I've drafted the resolution letter. Read it. Not to approve it. I'm sending it either way. Read it so that you understand it. Ask me questions about it. Understand what I did there and why." He nodded. "Then the Eastfield survey issue," she said. "The 3 acres in the documentation. That's still unresolved. I've been managing it, but I want you to understand what's happening there and why it matters. So that if someone tries it again, with me or with anyone else, you know what to look for." "All right. And I want—" She stopped. This was the harder one. "I want you to go to the county land office and ask about the procedure for adding a co-holder's name to the estate documentation. Not to do it immediately, to understand how it works." He went still. "Nathaniel. That would be—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "That would be a significant public statement." "Yes," she said. "It would." He looked at her for a long time. "All right," he said again. She looked back at him, and for the first time in the conversation, she allowed herself to feel the small, cautious, not yet trusting thing that had been trying to get her attention all evening, and she named it carefully in her own mind as not hope exactly, but perhaps the space where hope might eventually grow. She turned back to her papers. "The Hartwell letter is on the right side of the desk. Take it with you tonight and read it before morning." He picked it up, stood to go. At the door, he stopped. "Margaret." She didn't look up. "Yes." "Thank you," he said, for not making this easier than it needed to be." She thought about that for a moment. "Go read the letter, Nathaniel," she said. He went. She sat alone in the study in the summer evening, and the house settled around her, and somewhere outside the field hands were finishing for the day, and the land that she had tended and fought for and never stopped believing in was quiet in the long gold light. She picked up her pen. She had a great deal more to write before morning. The letter from Brooks Sr. arrived on a Friday. Not Nathaniel's father. He had been dead 8 years. This was Edmund Brooks, Nathaniel's older brother, who had spent the past decade managing the family's secondary holdings in Northern Virginia, and who had, in Margaret's private estimation, always considered himself the smarter of the 2 brothers, without having much evidence to support that conclusion. She was at the study table when Mrs. Pryor brought it in, still sealed, addressed to Nathaniel, but delivered to the front of the house, while Nathaniel was out walking the east field with the surveyor, something he had insisted on doing himself, after reading the Hartwell letter and spending 2 evenings asking her questions about the documentation she had filed. It was the kind of letter that had a quality even before you opened it. Something in the weight of the paper and the deliberateness of the seal that told you the person who sent it had written it carefully and expected it to matter. She set it on Nathaniel's desk and did not open it. That was not a line she would cross. But she noted it, and she thought about Edmund Brooks and what he might have heard through the county networks that moved information like water moves through soil, invisibly, pervasively, arriving in places you didn't expect. Nathaniel came back in mid-morning with dirt on his boots and a look on his face that she was beginning to recognize as the specific expression of a man who is discovering how much he didn't know about something he thought he understood. "The east boundary markers," he said, coming into the study and stopping when he saw the envelope on his desk. "3 of them have been repositioned, not recently. The soil displacement is old. Whoever moved them did it at least 2 years ago." 2 years ago, Margaret said, "is when Henderson took over the county surveyor's contract." Nathaniel looked at her. "You knew." "I suspected. I didn't have confirmation until I walked it myself last month." She paused. "That's what I was doing the afternoon I came home early." He stood there for a moment with that information. Then he picked up the envelope, read the sender's name. His expression shifted. "Edmund," he said. Not a question. "It arrived this morning." He opened it. She watched his face as he read, not intrusively, But she had spent 6 years learning to read Nathaniel Brooks by his face because his words were often unreliable, and she had not lost the habit. She watched his jaw set, and then release, and then set again, and she knew before he spoke that whatever was in that letter had not been friendly. He set it on the desk and turned it so she could read it. She did. Edmund Brooks wrote the way he conducted himself in person, smoothly, with the appearance of reasonableness, concealing a great deal of maneuvering. The letter expressed concern. It expressed fraternal care. It expressed the hope that Nathaniel was navigating a difficult personal situation wisely. And embedded in those expressions, with the precision of a man who had learned to say damaging things in the language of support, were 3 specific points. That the situation with Margaret had become a matter of county discussion, that certain people were questioning the stability of the Brooks estate, and that Edmund himself, purely out of concern of course, had been in conversation with 2 of the family's creditors about the matter. Margaret read it twice, set it back down. "He's moving," she said. "What do you mean?" "He's positioning himself," she said. "If the estate appears unstable, if there's a disputed dissolution, a public question about management and authority, then he has grounds to involve himself in the family holdings. He's the older brother. He has standing." She looked up at Nathaniel. "He's been waiting for something like this." Nathaniel's face had gone still in a way she recognized as controlled fury. "He's been in contact with our creditors." "That's what he says. Which means either he has, or he wants you to believe he has, and at the moment it doesn't matter which. The effect is the same. He wants you uncertain." She picked up the letter again. "Who are the 2 creditors he's referring to? Do you know?" "The Hartwell family," Nathaniel said immediately. "And probably Blackwell. We have a note with Blackwell's bank in Richmond." "The Hartwell matter is resolved," Margaret said. "I sent the letter Monday. Samuel confirmed receipt yesterday." She set the letter down. "Blackwell is a different question. What do we do?" She noted the "we." She noted it and did not comment on it, but she noted it. "First," she said, "you reply to Edmund, calmly and specifically. You tell him the estate is stable, the Hartwell matter is resolved, and that you appreciate his concern and don't require his involvement." She paused. "Then we find out exactly what he said to Blackwell and whether there's damage to manage. And if there is? Then we manage it," she said. "The same way I've managed everything else." He looked at her for a moment. "Together," he said. She met his eyes. "Together," she said carefully, "is a word that implies I've agreed to something I haven't agreed to yet." "I know," he said. "I meant, with your guidance, your knowledge." He paused. "I don't know how to do this without you, Margaret. I'm aware that admitting that is something I should have arrived at considerably earlier. But I'm telling you now, because it's true." She studied him. "Write the letter to Edmund," she said. "I want to read it before it goes out." He sat down and wrote it in the next 20 minutes, and she read it, and she made 3 corrections, and he made them without argument, and the letter went out before noon. That was the first time in 6 years that Nathaniel Brooks had let his wife read and revise his correspondence. He didn't make a production of it, neither did she. But Mrs. Pryor, who had a gift for understanding the significance of small things, watched the letter go out with the Morning Post and allowed herself one small, satisfied nod before returning to her kitchen. The county gathering. The following Saturday was one of the seasonal social events that Virginia's propertied families treated as obligatory. A thing you attended because not attending said something, and what it said was that you had something to be ashamed of or afraid of, and neither of those was acceptable. Margaret had attended every one of these gatherings for 6 years. She had dressed carefully, spoken pleasantly, managed the social dimensions of being Nathaniel Brooks's wife with the same quiet competence she managed everything else, and she had come home every time and written in her journal exactly what had been said and by whom and what it meant for the networks of obligation and influence that ran underneath the surface of county life. She knew, going into this particular Saturday, that it was going to be different. Word had moved. Not all of it accurately, but enough. People knew about the Thursday meeting. People knew about the revised petition. People knew, or thought they knew, which amounted to the same social pressure, that something had shifted inside the Brooks household, and that Margaret was at the center of the shift. She dressed that morning with more care than usual. Not because she wanted to perform, but because she understood that some situations required a kind of visible steadiness, and that what she wore and how she carried herself would be read and interpreted before she opened her mouth, and she preferred to control what she could. Nathaniel came to her door, knocked, which he had rarely done, and asked if she wanted to arrive together. She considered it. "Yes," she said. "We arrive together. We leave together. Whatever happens in between, we do not present ourselves as a household in public collapse." "Agreed," he said. They drove in near silence, which was not uncomfortable. Margaret spent the ride organizing her thoughts, which was what she always did in carriages, and Nathaniel spent it looking out the window with the expression of a man bracing for something he's decided to meet head-on rather than avoid. They arrived. The gathering was at the Alderman property. Martha Alderman, whose practical intelligence Margaret had always respected, which made it marginally better than it might have been at some other houses. The moment they walked in, Margaret felt the attention move toward them. Not rudely. Virginia society did not do things rudely when it could do them with exquisite, suffocating politeness, but unmistakably. Eyes tracking. Conversations pausing a half-beat too long. The particular social electricity of a room that has been discussing something and has been interrupted by the arrival of its subject. She kept her face calm and her chin level, and walked into it the way she had always walked into difficult things, directly, without flinching, with her eyes open. The first person to speak to her was Mrs. Fowler. "Mrs. Brooks," she said, with a smile that had warmth in it, like ice has warmth. "How lovely that you're both here. We'd heard, well, there was some question." "There's always some question," Margaret said pleasantly. "Fortunately, the actual answers are generally more interesting than the speculation. How is your husband, Mrs. Fowler? I heard his northern acreage had some drainage issues this spring." Mrs. Fowler blinked. Yes, there were some. "You ought to look at the gradient from the creek bend," Margaret said. "The water's pooling wrong. I noticed it last month riding past. If you address it before fall, you can probably save the corner lot." She smiled. "I'd be happy to send you my notes on it." She moved on before Mrs. Fowler could respond, and she heard Martha Alderman, 2 feet away, making a sound that was absolutely not a laugh. The morning moved. People approached with varying degrees of directness. Some asked outright about the dissolution. Margaret answered those questions the same way she answered everything, with specific, accurate information, delivered without drama or performance. "The estate is stable," she told James Hartley, who managed one of the neighboring farms and had the decency to ask her directly. "The Hartwell matter has been resolved. There's been some clarification of responsibilities within our household that was overdue. That's the accurate summary. And the dissolution is under discussion," she said, "as many things are." He nodded, satisfied, and moved on. It was past mid-morning when Edmund Brooks arrived. She saw him before Nathaniel did. She had been watching the door with the particular peripheral attention she had cultivated over years of managing rooms she wasn't supposed to be managing, and she had a moment to register his expression before he saw her. He was looking for Nathaniel. I was wearing the expression of a man who had sent a letter designed to produce a specific kind of anxiety and had arrived to assess whether it had worked. He found Nathaniel first. She watched them greet each other across the room, watched the body language. Edmund expansive and apparently warm, Nathaniel contained and polite in the way he was polite when he was holding something back. Then Edmund looked across the room and found her. She met his eyes calmly, from 20 feet away, and did not look away. He came to her. Of course he did. "Sister," he said, using the word with the practiced warmth of a man who uses warmth the way other men use tools. "I hope the summer hasn't been too taxing." "The summer has been clarifying," she said, "which I find preferable to comfortable." Something moved in his eyes. A small recalibration. "I wrote to Nathaniel last week," he said, "out of family concern. I hope he understood the spirit in which it was sent." "He understood it very well," she said. You'll need to be more specific if you want to know which part he found most interesting. Edmund's pleasant expression held in place by the specific effort of a man who has been smiling over difficult things for a long time. I simply want what's best for the estate, what's best for the family. Then you'll be pleased to know, Margaret said, that the estate is in better order than it has been in 3 years. The Hartwell matter is resolved. The Eastfield boundary issue is being corrected through the land office. The household accounts are current. She paused. If you've been in communication with our creditors, I'd appreciate knowing specifically what you told them, so that I can address any inaccuracies directly. A beat. I was simply, Edmund. She kept her voice pleasant. I'm not asking for an apology. I'm asking for the specific content of what you communicated, so that I can determine whether it requires any correction. That's a practical question, not a personal one. He looked at her for a long moment. The warmth in his expression was doing a great deal of work. I may have suggested, he said carefully, that there was some uncertainty about the management structure going forward. And to which creditor? Blackwell's representative was in town last week. I see. She filed that away. Thank you for being direct. I'll reach out to Blackwell directly. She picked up her cup. Enjoy the morning, Edmund. She turned away. She heard him not saying something, which was louder than if he had spoken. Across the room, she found Nathaniel watching her. He had seen the exchange. He didn't ask her what had been said. He read her face, and she let him read it, and he nodded once, and that was that. Martha Alderman appeared at her elbow with a second cup of coffee she hadn't asked for, and a look on her face that was entirely too satisfied to be called neutral. Mrs. Fowler is going to want your drainage notes, she said. She won't admit it, Margaret said. No, Martha agreed. But she'll use them. The real confrontation came later. She had not expected it to happen that morning, at the gathering, in front of the assembled families of Albemarle County. She had thought, had planned for, the confrontation to occur in the more controlled environment of a legal meeting, with Samuel and Tilson present, with documents on the table, with the formal structure of a proceeding to contain whatever needed to be said. What she had not accounted for was Edmund Brooks deciding, partway through the morning, that controlled environments were not in his interest. He found Nathaniel in the far corner of the main room, where Nathaniel had been in conversation with 2 other landowners about the fall planting questions. Margaret was 20 feet away, talking with Martha, close enough to hear the shift in the room's energy before she heard the words. Edmund's voice was not raised. That was the thing about men like Edmund. They understood that the most damaging things could be said in a perfectly reasonable tone of voice. The question, he said to Nathaniel, and I raise it simply as a practical family concern, is whether the estate can be properly managed if its authority is unclear. If decisions are being made without proper oversight. If... Edmund. Nathaniel's voice was quiet and entirely flat. I'm simply saying that from a creditor's perspective. Stop. The conversations immediately around them tapered off. Not all at once, gradually, naturally, the way water finds its level. You went to Blackwell, Nathaniel said. I had a conversation. You went to our creditor, Nathaniel said, and you planted a question about stability, about management, about whether decisions are being made without oversight. He paused. Without asking me first, without asking Margaret. I was concerned. You were positioning yourself, Nathaniel said. Don't. The word was quiet and very clear. Don't dress it up, not here, not in front of these people. The room had gone quite still. Margaret stayed where she was. She had not moved toward the conversation, had no intention of moving toward it, because this was Nathaniel's to do, and she understood the importance of him doing it himself, in front of this specific audience, on this specific morning. Edmund's composure held, but the edges of it were working harder. Nathaniel, I think... Edmund. Nathaniel turned to face his brother fully. I want to be very clear about something. The management of this estate, all of it, including the things I didn't know were being managed, has been conducted by my wife, not by me alone, by both of us, in practice, for 6 years. He paused. I was the last person in this room to understand that. I don't intend to keep being the last person. Silence. The estate is stable, Nathaniel said. The Hartwell matter is resolved. The Eastfield survey is being corrected. My wife has managed our creditor relationships with more skill than I have. If Blackwell has concerns, Margaret will address them, and they will be addressed correctly, and that will be the end of it. Another pause. If you have further family concerns, you can raise them with both of us, directly, like an adult, not through our creditors. Edmund looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked across the room at Margaret. She met his gaze with the same steady calm she'd brought to everything that week. She did not smile. She did not show him her cards. She simply let him understand that she had heard every word and that the position was clear. Edmund straightened his jacket. He nodded. One small, precise nod that conveyed nothing and conceded nothing, but was the only available exit from the situation with any dignity remaining. He excused himself. He did not speak to Margaret again that morning. The room recalibrated. Conversations resumed. But the way air changes after lightning, the charge dissipating, the new conditions settling in. Martha Alderman, still at Margaret's elbow, said nothing for a moment. Then, well? Yes, Margaret said. He called you his wife, Martha said. In front of all of us. He did, Margaret said. Not possessively. He said it the way you'd say, he said it like it was a title. Margaret looked across the room to where Nathaniel was still standing, now speaking again with the two landowners, his posture resettled, his jaw no longer quite so set. I noticed that, she said quietly. They drove home in silence, but it was a different silence than the one on the way there. It held more in it. At some point, maybe half a mile from the house, Nathaniel said, I meant it, what I said. I know, she said. Not for the audience. I want you to know that. I know, she said again. He glanced at her. You're not going to make this easy, are you? No, she said. I told you I wouldn't. Right. He turned back to the road. Good. They came into the house, and Margaret went directly to the study and opened her journal and wrote for 20 minutes without stopping, getting everything down while it was still sharp. Edmund's face, Nathaniel's words, the quality of the room's silence, Martha's observation about the word wife, the specific way Edmund's composure had cost him something to maintain. She wrote it all. Then she sat back and read it through once. Then she wrote, Something is changing. I don't know yet if I trust it, but I am watching it happen, and I am keeping my eyes open, and I am not deciding what it means before I have evidence. That is the only honest position available to me right now. She closed the journal. Samuel Hayes arrived at 3 o'clock. He came in with the particular expression he'd worn in their very first meeting 2 months ago, the one that meant he had information that was significant and had spent the drive over deciding how to present it. She made him coffee and waited. The land office has a problem, he said. The Eastfield survey. Bigger than the 3 acres. He set his cup down. Henderson didn't just mismark your boundary. When I had someone look at his other work from the same period, the same 2 years, there are 8 properties in this county with documentation errors. All of them small enough to miss individually. All of them in the same direction. Land moved from the original holder toward properties connected to a development group that was buying quietly in this area. Margaret sat very still. Someone was using Henderson, she said. Someone was using Henderson, Samuel confirmed. And Henderson's going to say he made honest errors, and maybe he did, and maybe he didn't, but either way, you have a decision to make. He looked at her. Because you found it first. You're the one who walked the boundary markers and noticed the discrepancy. Your documentation is the first formal record of the problem. Which means you can raise it formally with the land office, as a matter affecting your property alone, and get your 3 acres corrected and let the rest of it go unnoticed. He paused. Or you can raise it as what it actually appears to be, a systematic pattern affecting multiple properties, which turns a surveying error into a legal matter, and which puts your name and your documentation at the center of a county-level land case. Margaret was quiet. That second option, Samuel said carefully. Makes you very visible. Very publicly visible, in a way that goes beyond. It's not just the Brooks estate at that point. You'd be the woman who caught it. In front of the land office. In front of the families whose properties were affected. In front of everyone, she said. Yes. She turned her coffee cup in her hands for a moment. She thought about her father's words. The only way to find out if you can do a thing is to do it. She thought about what she had written in her journal that morning, about being invisible, and the question of what it would mean to step into the center. She thought about the 8 families who didn't yet know that their boundaries had been moved. If it were only about me, she said, I might choose quiet. I am very good at quiet. She set the cup down. But there are 8 families, and someone used Henderson because they believed no one was paying careful enough attention to notice, and I noticed. She looked at Samuel. What does the formal process look like? He told her. She listened. She asked questions. She asked the questions that a woman who had been paying attention to land management and legal documentation for 6 years would ask, and Samuel answered them with the specificity they deserved. At the end of it, she said, I want to bring Nathaniel into this. Samuel's expression registered something. You want his, not his permission, she said, his knowledge. He should know, and, she paused. If I'm going to be publicly visible in a way that affects this estate, he should be standing next to me when it happens, not behind me, next to me. She heard what she had just said. She thought about it for a moment. I want to see if he will, she added quietly. I want to see what he does when the situation asks it of him directly. Samuel looked at her with the expression he reserved for things he considered significant. That's a test, he said. Everything is a test right now, she said. I'm just finally saying so out loud. She went to find Nathaniel. I was in the library, the same library where this had all begun, 2 weeks ago, with a petition on the desk and a woman in the doorway, and a silence that had changed everything. He was at his desk, writing, and he looked up when she came in. Samuel's here, she said. I know, I saw him arrive. He set his pen down. What's happened? She told him. All of it. The 8 properties. The pattern. The decision in front of her. He listened the way he'd been listening all week. Differently than before, with more of himself in it. Without the deflecting half-attention he'd always used when topics exceeded the categories he'd assigned her to. When she finished, he was quiet for the moment. What do you want to do? He asked. I want to raise it formally, she said. The full pattern, not just our 3 acres. He nodded. Slowly, but without hesitation. Then we do that, he said. You understand what that means, she said. Publicly. Visibly. My name on the documentation. My findings presented to the land office. In front of everyone. Not as your wife managing household affairs. As the person who identified a county-wide land scheme. He looked at her directly. Yes, he said. I understand. And? He stood. And I'll be standing there, he said. Next to you, not behind you. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. She turned to go back to Samuel. Margaret. She stopped. For what it's worth, he said. I'm glad you found it. I'm glad you walked those markers yourself and didn't rely on Henderson's numbers. I'm glad... He paused. I'm glad you were paying attention when I wasn't. She stood in the doorway of the library, in the same house where 2 weeks ago she had set her writing gloves on the desk and begun dismantling every assumption her husband had made about what she was. She thought about the fear she had named in her journal that night, about not knowing how to exist in the center. I have been paying attention, she said, for a very long time. She went back to Samuel, and for the first time in 6 years, she didn't wait until she was alone to do the work that mattered. The formal filing with the land office was set for Monday morning. Samuel had prepared the documentation over the weekend, a full 40-page submission that laid out the pattern across all 8 affected properties, with Margaret's original boundary measurements as the foundational evidence, supported by the surveying records she had collected and cross-referenced across 3 years of Henderson's work. It was, Samuel told her privately, the most thorough private land complaint he had seen submitted to the Albemarle County Land Office in 20 years of practice. Margaret spent Sunday reading through every page. Not because she didn't trust Samuel's work, because she needed to know it the way she knew everything she put her name to, completely, from the first number to the last. She needed to be able to answer any question that came at her without hesitation, without looking to the man beside her for confirmation, without giving anyone in that room the satisfaction of watching her falter. Nathaniel found her at the study table at 11 that night, still reading. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she acknowledged him. "You should sleep," he said. "I'll sleep when I've finished," she said. He came in, sat across from her, didn't offer to help. He had learned, in recent days, that offering to help was often a way of making himself feel useful, rather than actually being useful, and that Margaret had no need of his feelings of usefulness. Instead, he poured himself a cup of the cold coffee from the pot on the corner of the table and sat quietly while she read. She noted it. She didn't comment on it, but she noted it. At midnight she closed the last page and sat back. "I'm ready," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him across the table. "Are you?" He considered the question honestly, which she had noticed he was increasingly doing, taking her questions seriously instead of answering them reflexively. "I don't fully understand everything in those pages," he said. "I won't pretend I do, but I understand what it means, and I'll be there." "That's enough," she said. "For now, that's enough." She went to bed and slept without difficulty, the way she always slept before something significant, deeply, cleanly, with none of the anxious wakefulness that plagued people who hadn't prepared. She had prepared. Whatever came in the morning, she had prepared. The land office was a low brick building on the main street of Charlottesville, and it smelled like old paper and tobacco, and the particular mustiness of official records that had been accumulating for 50 years. Margaret had been inside it exactly once before, in the first year of her marriage, handling a minor registration matter for the Caldwell lease, and she had found it then, as she found it now, a place that managed to be both significant and deeply unimpressive at the same time. The registrar was a man named Obert Crane. He was 50-something, dry, efficient, and had the look of a man who had been surprised by very little in the last 20 years of his professional life. Margaret watched him begin Samuel's submission and watched the precise moment, about 4 minutes in, when his expression shifted from professional neutrality to something more careful. He read without speaking for 11 minutes. Samuel sat to Margaret's left. Nathaniel sat to her right. Two of the other affected landowners, James Hartley, who Margaret had spoken to at the gathering, and a man named Peterson, whose northern acreage abutted the Brooks property on one side, had been notified and were present as well, seated in the row behind. When Crane set the last page down, he looked at Margaret. "You walked the boundaries yourself," he said. "I did," she said. "And the discrepancy you found is documented on pages 7 through 12, she said. "My original measurements, recorded within 24 hours of the walk, with the date and the specific markers in question, identified by the reference numbers in Henderson's own filing." He looked at her for a moment. She had the feeling he was recalibrating, the same recalibration she had seen in Tilson, in Edmond, in the gathering, the specific adjustment that happened when a man in an official position encountered a woman who had done the work more thoroughly than he had expected. "And you believe the pattern across the other 7 properties is connected," Samuel said. "The submission documents the directional consistency of the errors and the timeline correlation with Henderson's contract period. We're not asserting intent at this stage. We're asserting pattern and asking the office to conduct its own investigation." Crane turned the pages back to the center of the document. He read something again. He picked up his pen and made a note. "This will require a formal inquiry," he said. "Henderson will be notified and given opportunity to respond. The affected properties will each need to submit their own documentation of original boundaries." "We have identified the relevant records for all 8 properties," Samuel said. "They're referenced in Appendix 2. Crane found Appendix 2. His expression did the small, controlled thing again. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "how long have you had this documentation?" I identified my own discrepancy last month, she said. The correlation with the other properties became apparent when I reviewed Henderson's other filings from the same period. And you reviewed those filings? At the public records window, she said. 3 weeks ago. They're publicly available. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he looked at Samuel, then at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said nothing. He had been notably quiet since they arrived, and Margaret had been aware of that quiet as something deliberate. He was making room. Actively, consciously making room for her to occupy the space that was hers in this room, not filling it with his own voice simply because he was accustomed to being the one who spoke. She had not expected that from him. She had hoped for it. She had not expected it. "We'll open a formal inquiry," Crane said. "I expect we'll need to speak with you again, Mrs. Brooks, once Henderson's response is received." "I'm available," she said. They left the building 20 minutes later, and standing outside in the July heat, James Hartley shook Margaret's hand. An unusual gesture, man to woman, in this context, in this year, in this county, and said, "My father always said Thomas Caldwell's daughter was worth knowing. I should have paid more attention sooner." "Most people should have," she said pleasantly. "No harm in starting now." He laughed, surprised, genuine, and went to his horse. Peterson looked at her with a more complicated expression. He was older, more set in his understanding of things, and she could see him working through the cognitive distance between what he'd expected this morning and what had actually occurred. "I'll get my boundary records to Samuel by Wednesday," he said, which was not an apology and was not a compliment, but was his version of acknowledgement, and she accepted it for what it was. Samuel walked to his own horse with the expression of a man deeply satisfied with how a morning had gone. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Nathaniel drove her home. Halfway there, he said, "Hartley shook your hand." "He did," she said. "I've known James Hartley for 12 years, he said. "He has shaken my hand perhaps 3 times, and only at moments he considered significant." She said. "Margaret." "Yes. I want to say something, and I want you to hear it as what it is, not as flattery, and not as an attempt to make myself look better than I've been." She looked at him. "All right. What you did in there," he said. "What you did 3 weeks ago, walking those markers, and before that with the Hartwell correspondence, and before that with all of it. All 6 years of it." He paused. "I have never in my life done anything that required that quality of sustained attention and intelligence and patience. The patience to do it without recognition for years and still do it right." He looked at the road. I don't have a word for what that is. I've been trying to find one since Thursday and I can't." She was quiet for a moment. "Commitment," she said. "To what?" "To the work itself," she said. "Not to the recognition, not to the reward. To the thing that needed doing, because it needed doing." She paused. "That's what my father taught me. You do it right because it's right to do it right. Everything else is secondary." He drove for a while. "I want to be that," he said. "That quality of commitment, to something that deserves it." She looked at him. "Then find something that deserves it," she said, "and do it. Quietly, correctly, without waiting for someone to tell you that you've done well." She paused. "That's the whole of it." He absorbed that for the rest of the drive home. Henderson's response came back in 8 days. He claimed honest error. He had a prepared statement, clearly written with legal assistance, that cited the challenges of accurate surveying in varied terrain and expressed regret for any discrepancies and offered to cooperate fully with the office's investigation. He did not mention the development group. He did not mention any pattern. Crane sent Samuel a copy. Samuel brought it to Margaret. She read it at the study table in 15 minutes and set it down with the precise calm of a woman who had expected exactly this and had prepared for it. "He's going to let it be incompetence," she said. "It protects him legally," Samuel said. "Incompetence is not fraud. He loses his contract, probably pays a modest fine, the boundaries get corrected, and it's over." And the development group. Without Henderson naming them or documentation connecting them to the mismarkings directly, we can't prove instruction. Samuel paused. "We can suspect. We cannot prove." Margaret folded her hands on the table. What do we have? We have the pattern, Samuel said. 8 properties, consistent direction, consistent timing. A land court would look at that and see what it is. But to bring it to a land court, you need a named party. Henderson is claiming incompetence, not conspiracy, without him naming who directed him. Who are the buyers? She said. The development group. What do we know? Samuel hesitated. There are 3 names connected to the land purchases in that corridor over the past 2 years. One of them is a Richmond speculator with a history of this kind of accumulation. One is a silent investor we haven't been able to identify. And one... He stopped. She looked at him. Samuel. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, a kind of reluctant, sorry steadiness. One of the buyers, he said, is Edmund Brooks. The room went absolutely silent. Margaret sat very still. She thought about the letter. Edmund's careful, concerned, fraternal letter, expressing worry about management and stability and the involvement of creditors. She thought about his face at the gathering, the warmth that cost him something to maintain. She thought about the East Field boundary. 3 acres, shifted in the documentation. 3 acres that, if the dissolution had proceeded on the original terms, before she had intervened, might have ended up in a contested gray area of property assignment during settlement. He wasn't positioning himself to manage the estate, she said. No, Samuel said quietly. He was positioning himself to acquire the land. The eastern acreage specifically. That corridor connects to the other parcels that have been moving. There's a road project being discussed in Richmond, a trade route that would run through exactly that land if it proceeds. Property in that corridor will be worth 3 times its current value within 10 years. She sat with that for a moment. She was not surprised. She found, examining herself honestly, that she was not surprised at all, and that the absence of surprise was itself a kind of grief, the grief of being right about something you had hoped to be wrong about. Does Nathaniel know? She asked. Not yet, Samuel said. I came to you first. She nodded, stood, walked to the window, and stood there for a moment with her back to the room. She thought about Nathaniel's face at the gathering. The management of this estate has been conducted by my wife. She thought about the drive home from the land office. I want to be that quality of commitment. She thought about 11 o'clock on Sunday night, sitting quietly across from her while she read, drinking cold coffee and not making himself the center of what she needed to do. She turned around. I need to tell him, she said. Yes, Samuel said. Today. Now. Yes. She went to find her husband. How was in the East Field? She walked out to find him. Didn't send someone. Didn't wait for him to come in at his own pace. Walked out herself, across the yard, through the gate, along the path she had walked 100 times in 6 years, because she had always been the one who went to the fields rather than waiting for the fields to report to her. How was standing at the corrected boundary markers, with a measuring line in his hand and the surveyor's notes from the land office in his other hand, cross-referencing them himself. He had been doing this every morning since the filing, going out to the East Field, checking the work, learning the measurements, understanding the land in the way she had always understood it. He looked up when he saw her coming, and something in her face stopped him. She told him, standing there in the East Field, in the July heat, with the boundary markers around them, that his brother had conspired to shift in a document. She told him plainly, the way she told him everything now, without softening and without cruelty, just the facts as Samuel had laid them out. The 3 names, the development group, the road project in Richmond, the value of the Eastern Corridor. She watched his face. She had been watching Nathaniel Brooks's face for 6 years. She had learned it the way you learn territory you live in. Every variation, every weather. She knew his controlled fury face, and his deflecting face, and the face he wore when he was about to say something proud, and the face he wore when he was genuinely ashamed. What moved through his face in the next 30 seconds was something she had never seen there before. It was not fury, though fury came after. It was not shame, though that came too. What came first was grief. Clean, undefended, honest grief. The kind a man feels when someone he has defended without question reveals themselves to be something he cannot defend. He stood there in the field with the measuring line in his hand, and he did not speak for a long time. He knew, Nathaniel said finally, about the dissolution. I told him, 3 months ago, before I told him I was considering it. He stopped. I told him about the estate, the situation with the Hartwells. He was the one who suggested He stopped again. Margaret was very still. He suggested I move forward with the dissolution, Nathaniel said. He framed it as, he said the instability was affecting the estate's reputation, that a clean break would be better for the holdings long term. He looked at the measuring line in his hand like he had forgotten it was there. He knew what the dissolution would do to the boundary questions. If the Caldwell lease and the eastern acreage were both in dispute during settlement, he would have had a window to, yes, Margaret said quietly. The word landed between them. Nathaniel's hand closed around the measuring line. He used me, he said. He used the situation, she said carefully, which you created. But yes, he saw the opportunity and moved toward it. He looked at her. You could have told me this to punish me. I'm telling you this, she said, because it's your family, your estate, and your brother, and you deserve to know the truth about all three. She paused. What you do with it is your decision. He was quiet for another long moment. What does Samuel recommend? He said. Samuel recommends we bring what we have to Crane at the land office and let the inquiry expand to include the documented buyers. Edmund's name is in the purchase records. That's public documentation. The connection to the pattern is Samuel's argument to make, and he believes he can make it. And Edmund goes on record as a party to the inquiry. She paused. He may still claim he didn't direct Henderson. He may be able to make that stick legally, but his name and the pattern will be in the same public record, and that will mean something in this county for a long time. Nathaniel absorbed that. Do it, he said. Nathaniel, do it, he said again, steadily. He used my marriage, my wife, my land, as a mechanism for theft. I don't care that he's my brother. I care about what's right. He met her eyes. And I care about you not being robbed of what you built. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the word he'd used. Wife. The way he'd said it at the gathering, like a title. The way he was saying it now, like a fact, like something he was choosing to mean. All right, she said. I'll tell Samuel to proceed. She turned to go. Margaret. His voice stopped her, low and uncertain in a way she hadn't often heard from him. I know I've said this badly before. I know I've said things and not followed them, and you've had no reason to believe anything I say. He paused. But I want to say it anyway, and I want you to hear it even if you're not ready to do anything with it. He looked at her directly. I'm sorry. Not for the dissolution, or not only for that. I'm sorry for 6 years of walking past you and not seeing you. I'm sorry for training you, the way you said, to stay invisible. I'm sorry for letting you carry things you should never have had to carry alone. He stopped. That's what I'm most sorry for. That you had to be so capable in private because you weren't safe enough to be capable in public. That's on me. She stood with that. She didn't tell him it was all right. It wasn't all right, and they both knew it, and she respected him too much now to offer him the comfort of a lie. I hear you, she said. That's enough, he said. For now, that's enough. She almost smiled. He had used her words back to her. She did not think he had done it intentionally. She thought it was simply what came to him, and that was its own kind of evidence. She went back inside. Edmund Brooks received the formal notification from the land office on a Wednesday. Margaret was not there when it arrived at his property in Northern Virginia, but Samuel's contact in that county sent word of the reaction, which was the kind of reaction a man has when he has spent months constructing a careful position and receives documentation that the foundation has been pulled out from under it. He rode south the following day. Margaret knew he was coming before he arrived. Mrs. Pryor had sources. Margaret had long since stopped questioning. And she told Nathaniel. And they were both in the front parlor when Edmund came through the door, which was not where Edmund had planned to find them. He had, she suspected, expected to find Nathaniel alone. Edmund looked at her, looked at Nathaniel, looked at the specific quality of how they were positioned, side by side, facing the door, not performing unity, but simply present in it. "Nathaniel," he said, "I'd like to speak with you privately." "There's nothing you need to say to me," Nathaniel said, "that Margaret can't hear." A pause. "I want to explain." "Edmund." Nathaniel's voice was very quiet. "I've read Samuel's documentation. I've seen the purchase records. I know about the road project." He paused. "I know what you did." Edmund's composure was doing the same effortful work it had done at the gathering, the warmth costing more than it showed. The purchase was a legitimate business interest. The surveying errors were Henderson's. "You told me," Nathaniel said, "to proceed with the dissolution. You told me the instability was affecting the estate's reputation. You framed it that way specifically because you needed the boundary questions unsettled during a settlement proceeding to create your window." He paused. "How long have you been watching for that window?" Edmund said nothing. "How long?" Nathaniel said again, quieter. "I identified the road project potential 2 years ago," Edmund said finally. "The corridor was undervalued. Anyone with eyes could see." "You used my marriage," Nathaniel said. "I identified an opportunity. You told me my wife was a liability." The words came out flat and without heat, which was worse than anger. "You told me the household management situation was creating instability, and that I needed to act. You used my pride against me, and my ignorance against me, and you pointed both of them at my wife, because you needed her out of this house and the property in dispute to get what you wanted." He stood. "Get out." Edmund stiffened. "Nathaniel, I am your brother." "You are my brother," Nathaniel said. "And you use that too. Get out of my house, Edmund. Talk to Samuel or talk to Crane or talk to your own attorney. I don't care. But do not come to me expecting family loyalty to cover what you've done." Edmund looked at Margaret. She met his eyes with the same steady calm she had brought to every confrontation in the past 3 weeks. She did not speak. She did not need to. He left. The door closed behind him. Nathaniel stood in the center of the parlor, and the silence settled around him, and he looked like a man who has done something necessary and is sitting with the cost of it. Margaret walked to him. Not to comfort. She was not there yet, and she would not pretend otherwise. But she stood beside him, which was a different thing, and she said, "That was right." He looked at her. "What you said," she clarified. "All of it. It was right." He nodded once, slowly. "I didn't know," he said, "how much I had been managed, by him, for years." He paused. "He told me things about you, early in our marriage, about your father's family, about what he called your overreach in household matters. I should have questioned it." "He saw what I was early," Margaret said. "He understood before you did that I was a complication for what he wanted." She paused. "That's almost a compliment." Nathaniel let out a breath that had something almost like a laugh in it, ragged at the edges. "You're extraordinary," he said. "I want you to know that I know that. Whatever you decide, about this, about us, I want you to know that I know what you are." She looked at him steadily. "What I decide," she said, "will take more time, and I want to be clear about what that means. I'm not leaving. I'm also not returning to what we were. What we were is not a place I'm willing to go back to." She paused. "What I'm willing to consider is something that doesn't exist yet, something that would have to be built new, from where we actually are, not from where we pretended to be." "That would require starting over," he said. "Not entirely," she said. "We have 6 years of work between us. We have a real estate with real challenges and real workers who depend on it. We have whatever this last month has been, which is at least more honest than the 6 years before it." She paused. "I'm willing to start from here, from this exact point, and see what gets built." He was quiet for a moment. "On what terms?" he said. "What would you need?" "My name on the estate documentation," she said. "Not as a courtesy, as a legal co-holder of record. Samuel can draw up the paperwork. He's already looked into the mechanism." She paused. My management of the financial matters acknowledged and formalized. Not operating behind the scenes through household authority. Formally. Done, he said. I'm not finished, she said. He waited. The workers on the East Field, she said. Johnson's family. The drainage situation in their quarters has been a problem for 2 years. I've patched it twice. I want it properly fixed before fall. He blinked. Of course. The children in the tenant households, she said. There's no educational access. I've been teaching 4 of them on Tuesday afternoons in the kitchen, which Mrs. Pryor has been covering for me, but it's not enough. I want to formalize something. Space, materials, time. I was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. All right, he said. And I want... She stopped. This was the hardest one. I want you to tell me when you don't understand something. Not after it becomes a problem. When it happens. I want you to ask me, not assume I'll manage it invisibly. I want to be asked. He was quiet for a moment. I can do that, he said. I want to do that. She looked at him. She thought about the space where hope might eventually grow, which she had identified 3 weeks ago and been watching carefully since. It was larger than it had been. Tentatively, measurably larger. Then let's start there, she said. The land office inquiry concluded 6 weeks later. Henderson's incompetence claim held on the criminal question. There was not sufficient documentation to prove he had been directed rather than careless, and he had been careful enough in his own records to preserve that ambiguity. He lost his contract. He paid a fine. The boundaries across all 8 affected properties were formally corrected and re-registered. Edmund's name remained in the public record of the inquiry as a buyer of property in the affected corridor. The connection to the pattern was noted. No charge was brought. The legal standard for proving coordination was not met. But the record was there. In Albemarle County, where reputation and record were 2 sides of the same coin, that mattered. People knew how to read a land office inquiry. People knew what it meant when a man's name appeared in a pattern, even without a formal charge. Edmund Brooks spent the next year finding that the warmth he had always relied on in county relationships was running considerably thinner than it had before. Margaret noted this without satisfaction and without guilt. She had not sought to harm him. She had sought to tell the truth about what he had done. Those were not the same thing, and she was careful to maintain the distinction in her own mind. The morning the inquiry conclusion was filed, Samuel Hayes came to the house with the paperwork for the co-holder documentation. Nathaniel signed it first, then Margaret. Samuel witnessed it. He did not make a speech. He collected his copy, organized his folder, and said, with the complete simplicity of a man who had spent 40 years in the law and knew when a document meant something, "Well done." He left. Margaret held her copy of the document for a moment. Her name, on the estate record, in ink, legal and permanent and visible. She set it in the leather folder with the Hartwell correspondence and the mill lease and the alderman contract and the 6 years of work that now had a name on it. Mrs. Pryor appeared in the doorway with coffee, which she did at significant moments without being asked. "The children are here for Tuesday," she said. Margaret looked up. Through the window she could see 4 small figures in the yard. Johnson's eldest, 2 of the Peterson tenant children, and the youngest alderman girl who had started coming 3 weeks ago when her mother had heard about the arrangement and asked if there was room. "Tell them I'll be out in a moment," Margaret said. She stood, straightened, put the folder in the desk drawer. Nathaniel appeared at the study door, having come in from the East Field with his boots muddy and the surveying notes in his hand, and he looked at her with the specific expression that had been developing on his face over the past 6 weeks. The expression of a man who had been shown what he'd missed and was still, quietly, taking inventory. "Tuesday," he said. "The children." "Yes." "I'd like to come," he said. Not to take over, or to see what you're doing, to understand it." She looked at him. "All right," she said. He set his notes on the desk, washed his hands at the basin, came back to the doorway and stood beside her. They walked out to the yard together. The 4 children were in a loose cluster near the oak tree, And when they saw Margaret coming, they moved toward her with the particular energy of children who have been looking forward to something. And the youngest one, the alderman girl, 6 years old and already asking questions faster than anyone could answer them, ran the last few steps and took Margaret's hand without any ceremony at all, the way children take the hand of someone they trust without needing to think about it. Margaret held her hand. She looked at her name on the document in the desk drawer, in the folder with 6 years of invisible work that was invisible no longer. She thought about her father saying, "Always know the numbers." She thought about the woman she had been 2 months ago, walking in from the east field with riding gloves in one hand and a folded note in the other, not yet knowing that the afternoon was about to change everything. She thought about what she had written in her journal that night. "I am, for the first time in a considerable while, entirely awake." She was still awake, more awake than she had been in years. The kind of awake that does not have anything to do with sleep, and everything to do with the decision to see clearly and act accordingly, regardless of whether the world is ready for you to do so. Nathaniel stood beside her, watching the children, and he said nothing, and she said nothing, and the summer moved around them both with all the density and heat of Virginia in late August, and somewhere in the east field, the corrected boundary markers stood in the exact places they had always been meant to stand. The work was not finished. It never was. But for the first time in 6 years, every part of it had her name on it, and she intended to keep it that way. September came in hard that year, not cold. The heat of the Virginia summer didn't release its grip easily, and the early weeks of the month still carried that same dense warmth that had pressed down over everything since July. But there was something different in the quality of the light, something in the angle of it that told you the season was shifting, whether the temperature agreed or not. Margaret noticed it the way she noticed everything, quietly, without announcing it, filing it alongside the other things she was tracking. There was a great deal to track. The co-holder documentation had been filed with the county record on a Thursday. By Sunday, half of Albemarle County knew about it. By the following Tuesday, the other half did. She had expected the reaction to be mixed. She had prepared herself for the Mrs. Fowler contingent to find it unseemly, for the older landholding families to express their discomfort in the careful, indirect language of county society, for the question of propriety to be raised in the way it always was when a woman did something that exceeded the category she'd been assigned. What she had not fully prepared for was the other reaction, the one that came from the margins. Martha Alderman sent a letter. Not a social note, a real letter, 3 pages, in which she wrote with the kind of directness that women in this county rarely put on paper because paper persisted. "What you have done matters beyond your own household, Margaret. There are women in this county watching what happened to you and watching what you did about it, and they are paying attention. I want you to know that." The wife of the Peterson tenant farmer, a woman named Ruth, who Margaret knew by name but had never had real conversation with, came to the back door one afternoon and stood there with her hands clasped and said, "Mrs. Brooks, I heard about what you found, about the boundary markers, about my husband's family's land was one of the 8. "I know," Margaret said. "I want to say thank you," Ruth said, "not just for the land, for—" She stopped, looked for the words. "For making it something that got looked at, for making it matter." Margaret looked at her for a moment. "It always mattered," Margaret said. "Someone just had to say so out loud." Ruth nodded. She turned to go. Then she turned back. "My eldest is 7, she said. "I heard about the Tuesday lessons." "Tell her to come," Margaret said. "There's room." Ruth left, and Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment, and she thought about what Martha had written. There are women watching. And she felt the weight of that, the specific gravity of being seen not just by one man finally opening his eyes, but by a network of women who had been watching from their own margins and finding, in what she had done, some confirmation of something they had always quietly known. That was heavier than anything the land office had put in front of her. She was still thinking about it when Nathaniel found her. "You're standing in the doorway," he said. "I'm thinking," she said. "Anything you want to share?" She looked at him. He had flour on his sleeve, which meant he had been in the kitchen helping Mrs. Pryor with something, which was a thing that would have been unimaginable 3 months ago. and which he had apparently begun doing on Tuesday mornings when Margaret was with the children, and he had decided, with characteristic abruptness, that he wanted to understand how the household he'd lived in for 8 years actually operated. Mrs. Pryor had reportedly been startled the first morning and deeply approving by the third. "Martha Alderman wrote to me," Margaret said. "About the filing?" "About what the filing means," she said. "Beyond our property." He leaned against the doorframe. "What does it mean, beyond our property?" She looked at him. "It means that other women in this county made their own calculations about what was possible, and those calculations were based partly on what they observed in households like ours." She paused. "And what they observed, for a long time, was that a woman could work and manage and contribute and be excellent at all of it, and still be made invisible by the structure of the arrangement she lived inside." She paused. "The filing says something different. It says the structure can change." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you pushed for it?" he said. "Not just for yourself?" "I pushed for it for myself," she said honestly. "I needed it for myself first. But I'm not naive about what it echoes outward." She looked at the yard. "Ruth Peterson's daughter is coming to the Tuesday lessons next week." He nodded slowly. "You're building something," he said. "I'm acknowledging what was already there," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her with the expression that she still, 3 months in, hadn't entirely categorized, the one that had admiration in it, but also something more complicated, something that looked like a man revising his understanding of his own life's landscape and discovering that it was both more beautiful and more humbling than he had previously perceived. "What do you need from me?" he said. For the lessons. For the structure around it. What would make it work better than it does now?" She turned to look at him directly. This was new. Not just the question, but the asking of it. The specific willingness to subordinate his own sense of what was needed to her actual answer. "Space," she said. "The east room off the main hall. It's not being used. Proper furniture. Slates, at minimum, and paper when we can afford it. And..." She paused. "I want to bring in someone who can teach what I can't. Language. Mathematics beyond what I have time to give them." "A tutor," he said. "A teacher," she said. "For the children in this household and the tenant households both. Paid properly." He absorbed that. "That's a significant..." "I know what it costs," she said. "I know the accounts, better than you do." She said it without edge. It was simply fact, and they both knew it. "It's manageable. And it's right." He was quiet for a moment. "Write up what you need," he said. "I'll look at the accounts and tell you what I see, and you'll tell me where I'm wrong, and we'll figure out what's possible." "What you see," she said, "and what I see are likely to be different." "Probably," he said. "That's why I'm asking." She looked at him for one more moment. "All right," she said. The first real test of what they were building came 3 weeks later, on a morning that began normally and did not stay that way. A man arrived at the front of the house before breakfast. Not a man Margaret knew. A representative, he said, from a land development firm in Richmond, with a letter of inquiry regarding the eastern acreage and whether the Brooks family might consider a purchase offer. Mrs. Pryor, who had the instincts of someone who had been managing the front of a household for 40 years, told him to wait and came immediately to find Margaret. Margaret read the letter in 2 minutes, set it down, picked it up again, read the firm's name. She knew the name. It was the same firm that had been quietly buying in the Eastern Corridor. The same firm whose name had appeared, connected to Edmonds, in Samuel's documentation. She went and found Nathaniel. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it. His jaw set in the particular way it had been setting when he encountered things that made him angry, and had decided to be deliberate rather than reactive. "They're trying again," he said. "Through a different mechanism," she said. "The land scheme didn't work. The inquiry closed their window on the boundary question. So now they're coming directly with a purchase offer." She paused. "Which is legal, and which we are entirely within our rights to decline." "We decline," he said immediately. "Yes," she said, But I want to do it in writing. I want it on record that we received this offer, considered it, and declined, and that we are aware of the firm's connection to the boundary inquiry." She paused. "That letter goes into the public record through Samuel. Let them know we know." He looked at her. "You want them to understand that approaching us is not without consequence. I want them to understand that we are paying attention," she said. "That is all. We don't need to threaten. We don't need to pursue. We just need them to know that we see them clearly." He handed the letter back to her. "Write it," he said. "I'll sign it." "We'll both sign it," she said. He nodded. She sat down at the study table and wrote the response in 20 minutes. Careful, specific, utterly polite, and precise as a blade. She handed it to Nathaniel. He read it. "You're remarkable," he said. "I'm prepared," she said. "There's a difference." She picked up her pen. "Sign it." He did. It went out that afternoon. They never heard from the Richmond firm again. October brought the first real cold, and it brought Samuel Hayes with news that Margaret had not anticipated. He came on a Wednesday afternoon, and he had the expression he wore when something had happened that was significant and complicated and required careful handling. She made coffee. She waited. "I had a letter from Philadelphia," he said. "From Caroline Whitmore." Margaret set her cup down. "She's writing through an attorney," Samuel said. "She's asking. She wants to know if you would be willing to speak with her. Not about Nathaniel, not about the estate." He paused. "She's found herself in a situation in Philadelphia that has some legal dimensions, and she's been told, apparently by the attorney she consulted there, that you might be the right person to talk to." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "What kind of situation?" she said. "A property matter," Samuel said. "Her family's business arrangement with a Philadelphia merchant. She believes there are irregularities in the documentation she signed. She wants someone who understands these things to look at what she has." Margaret absorbed that. She thought about Caroline Whitmore in the front parlor. "I want to build my own thing. I want my name on it." She thought about the steadiness in Caroline's voice when she said it, the quality of someone arriving at a conclusion they weren't comfortable with, but had chosen anyway. She thought about what Martha Alderman had written. "There are women watching." "Tell her I'll see her," Margaret said. Samuel looked at her with the expression he reserved for things he considered significant. "You understand this will be, people will notice." "People always notice," Margaret said. "I've stopped organizing my decisions around that." He nodded. "I'll write back today." After he left, Margaret sat for a while at the study table. She thought about Caroline. Not with warmth exactly, not yet, but with something honest and clear-eyed. They were not friends. They might never be friends. But they were two women who had, from different positions and different motivations, ended up in the same territory. The territory of understanding that the structure of things was not fixed, that documents and records and the names on legal papers mattered. That clarity was worth the discomfort it cost. That was enough to start with. Nathaniel, when she told him that evening, was quiet for a moment. "You're going to help her," he said. "I'm going to look at what she has," Margaret said. "If it's what she thinks it is, then yes." Another pause. "Good," he said. She looked at him. "You're not—" "What?" He met her eyes. "Bothered? That you're helping the woman who was in my library 2 months ago?" He shook his head. "She made her own choice and she came to you, and you're the right person to help her, and that's the whole of it." He paused. "And I'd rather she came to you than have no one to come to." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the space where hope might eventually grow. She had been watching it carefully, measuring it the way she measured everything, honestly, without wishful inflation. It was real. That was what she could say. Whatever it would become, it was real. "I'm going to the Caldwell farm next week," she said, "to see my father." Something moved through his expression. "You haven't been since before July," she said. "I know. I want to go." She paused. "I want to show him the co-holder documentation." Nathaniel was quiet. "I'd like to come with you," he said, "if you'll allow it." She considered it. My father will have questions, she said. I know. He'll ask you things directly. He's not a man who softens what he wants to know. I know, he said again. I've met Thomas Caldwell. I should have paid more attention to who raised you, a long time ago. He paused. I'd like to answer his questions. She looked at him steadily. All right, she said. They rode to the Caldwell farm on a Tuesday, which meant Margaret rearranged the children's lesson to Monday, which Mrs. Pryor managed with the efficiency of someone who had long since accepted that the household schedule revolved around Margaret's priorities and had strong opinions about that being correct. Thomas Caldwell was 63 years old and looked it in his hands and his walk, and not in his eyes, which were the same sharp gray they had always been, and which landed on Nathaniel Brooks the moment he stepped through the door with the quality of assessment that Thomas Caldwell had always conducted, directly, without performance, without pretense. Nathaniel, he said. Sir, Nathaniel said. They shook hands. Thomas held the grip a moment longer than strictly necessary, which was its own language. Then Thomas looked at Margaret. He looked at her the way a man looks at his daughter when he has been worried about her and has been refusing to say so and is now doing the silent accounting of relief. Come in, he said. They sat at the kitchen table, the Caldwell kitchen, which smelled of bread and the particular wood smoke of a farmhouse that had been in continuous use for 30 years. And Margaret put the co-holder documentation on the table. Thomas read it. He was quiet for a long time. This is signed, he said. Yes, Margaret said. Filed with the county. Yes. He looked up at Nathaniel. You did this voluntarily. I did, Nathaniel said. No one compelled you. No one compelled me, Nathaniel said. I should have done it 6 years ago. I didn't know enough to understand that then. He paused. I know it now. Thomas looked at him for a long time. My daughter, he said finally, has more intelligence in her than most men I've known in 60 years of living. I say that as a fact, not a compliment. I knew it when she was 8 years old and correcting my ledgers. He set the document down. When she married you, I told myself you were a good man who hadn't yet been required to be a good man, that sometimes it takes being required. Nathaniel said nothing. I was hoping I was right, Thomas said. And not just being a father who wanted to believe he hadn't made a mistake letting his daughter go to your house. You weren't wrong, Margaret said quietly. About the potential. You were optimistic about the timeline. Thomas looked at her. Something that might have been humor moved briefly through his expression. 6 years is a long timeline. Yes, she said. It is. He looked at Nathaniel again. What are you going to do with it? He said. Not the document, the knowledge. What you know now about what she is. Nathaniel held the older man's gaze without flinching. I'm going to try to be worthy of it, he said. I can't promise I'll always succeed. I can promise I'll keep trying, and I'll tell her when I'm getting it wrong, instead of waiting for her to find out on her own. Thomas studied him. Then he reached across the table and picked up his coffee. All right, he said. That was all. But from Thomas Caldwell, it was everything. Margaret felt something release in her chest, something she hadn't known she was holding until it let go. She had not realized, until that moment, how much she had needed her father to see what she had built. Not just the document, but the whole of it, the work and the reckoning, and the thing that was being constructed now out of the ruins and the truth. He saw it. That was enough. On the ride home, the afternoon going gold around them, Nathaniel said, Your father is a remarkable man. He raised me, she said, so I've always thought so. He was testing me, Nathaniel said. He was, she agreed. I don't blame him. I know you don't. He drove for a while. Margaret, he said. Yes. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that I'm not asking for reassurance. I'm asking because I need to understand where I actually stand so I can act accordingly. She turned to look at him. Do you? He stopped. Started again. Is there anything left in you that wants this? Not the arrangement, not the estate, not the practical management of what we've built together. Is there anything in you that wants me, specifically, as more than a co-holder and a man you're teaching to ask questions? The directness of it stopped her. She had not expected it. She had expected him to circle it, the way he had circled most difficult things, arriving at the edge and retreating, approaching and reconsidering. She had not expected him to ask it straight. She thought about her journal, about what she had written and what she had not written, about the things she had named carefully and the things she had not yet let herself name, because naming them too early had felt like a risk she wasn't ready for. She thought about flour on his sleeve on Tuesday mornings, about measuring line in his hand in the east field, about together, spoken quietly in a carriage, offered without demand, about the way he had stood beside her in the land office and made room. "I think there is," she said. "I'm not certain what shape it has yet. I've spent 6 years not letting myself look at it directly." She paused. "But I think there is." He was quiet. "That's honest," he said. "I told you I was done with anything else," she said. "You did." He adjusted the reins. "I'll take it," he said. "Whatever shape it has, I'll take it and I'll be careful with it." She looked at him. "Don't be careful," she said. "Be present. Careful is what we were before, managing everything at a distance so nothing could be damaged. Present is what I'm asking for." He looked at her. "All right," he said. "Present." She turned back to the road. The farm was behind them, and the estate was ahead, and between them the whole September afternoon stretched out clear and specific and real, with nothing in it that had been pretended or managed or kept invisible. She thought about the day she had walked in from the east field with riding gloves in one hand and a folded note in the other. The petition on the desk. The silence in the room. The moment she had understood that everything was about to require her full attention. She had given it her full attention. She had given it 6 years of invisible attention, and then 2 months of visible, named, documented, on the record attention, and the estate stood, and the boundaries were corrected, and her name was on the paper, and 4 children were learning their letters in the East Room on Tuesday afternoons, and Ruth Peterson's daughter was going to come next week, and Caroline Whitmore was in Philadelphia trying to figure out what her name meant on a document, and Martha Alderman had written 3 pages about women watching. She had not planned all of that. She had prepared, and then she had acted from what was true, and the rest had grown from the act. That was the whole of it, she thought. That was what her father had always tried to tell her. You do the work because it is right to do it. You tell the truth because it is the truth. You put your name on what you have built, and you let the rest sort itself. Caroline Whitmore arrived in November, 2 days before the first real frost. She came into the parlor looking different than the last time Margaret had seen her. Steadier, somehow, and thinner, and there was something in her eyes that had not been there in the summer. The quality of a woman who has been made to understand something difficult and has decided to understand it fully rather than partially. Margaret brought coffee, sat across from her. "Show me what you have," Margaret said. Caroline opened her bag and laid 4 documents on the table between them. Margaret read them. She read them the way she read everything, completely, with full attention, without rushing. She found the irregularity on page 3 of the second document. It was not unlike what Henderson had done with the boundary markers. Small, precise, directionally consistent, designed to be missed by someone who was not paying the specific and methodical kind of attention that Margaret Caldwell Brooks had been paying to documents since she was 8 years old correcting her father's ledgers. "Here," she said. She turned the document and pointed. Caroline leaned in. Read. Her face changed. That's an error that benefits one party consistently across all 4 documents," Margaret said. "Which means it is not an error." Caroline sat back. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "I signed these," she said. "You signed them," Margaret said. "You can challenge them. It is harder to challenge something you've signed, but the irregularity is real, and it is documentable, and Samuel Hayes can advise you on the legal mechanism in your state." She paused. "You will need your own attorney in Philadelphia. Samuel can recommend someone." You're going to help me," Caroline said. "After everything, I'm going to help you navigate a document you were deceived into signing, Margaret said. That's what this is. She looked at Caroline directly. I am not doing this because I have forgiven you for what you were part of, because that is a separate question that I am still working through on my own time. I'm doing this because you are a woman who has been deceived in a legal document and you came to the right person, and the right person helps. Caroline was quiet for a moment. That's very... She stopped. Honest, Margaret said. Yes, I've decided to be nothing else. Something moved through Caroline's expression. Not quite gratitude, something more complicated. The specific feeling of being seen accurately, without flattery and without cruelty, and finding that accurate seeing was itself a kind of gift. I want to learn, Caroline said. What you know. How to read documents this way. How to... I don't want to need someone else to find this for me next time. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Come on Tuesdays, she said. The children are in the morning. The afternoons are for other things. We can start with the basics. Caroline blinked. I am not your friend yet, Margaret said clearly. I want to say that plainly. But I am not your enemy, and you asked for the right thing, and I will teach anyone who asks for the right thing. She stood. Come on Tuesday. Caroline stood too. She held out her hand. Margaret shook it. After she left, Nathaniel was in the hallway. You heard, Margaret said. I heard enough, he said. He looked at her. Tuesdays are becoming very full. They are, she agreed. You're building a school, he said. I'm teaching people to read what's in front of them, she said. Documents and land and numbers and the things that are being done to them without their knowledge. She paused. That's not a school. That's just paying attention and teaching other people to do it. Margaret, he said. That's a school. She looked at him. She thought about her name on the estate document. She thought about Ruth Peterson's daughter coming on Tuesday. She thought about Martha Alderman's letter. She thought about what she had told Caroline. I will teach anyone who asks for the right thing. She thought about the woman she had been on the 14th of July, walking in from the East Field with riding gloves in her hand, not yet knowing that the afternoon was about to change everything. She thought about what she had written that night. I am, for the first time in a considerable while, entirely awake. She was still awake. More than awake. She was building. All right, she said to Nathaniel. It's a school. He smiled. Not the polished, composed expression she had known for 6 years, but something underneath that, something real and undefended. What do you need? He said. She thought for exactly 1 moment. More chairs, she said. We're going to need more chairs. He laughed. A real laugh, the kind she had not heard from him in 6 years of marriage because it had not been available to a man performing his authority at all times. The kind that comes from someone who has set something heavy down and found, to his surprise, that his hands are free. She looked at him. She let herself feel the thing she had been measuring carefully for 3 months. The thing she had told him had a shape she couldn't yet identify. She let herself feel it directly, without managing it from a distance. It was not what they had before. What they had before had been arrangement and assumption and invisibility and pride on one side and survival on the other. What this was becoming, was something she did not have a word for yet, because it had not existed yet when they started building it. It was being made from honesty and reckoning and flour on Tuesday mornings, and measuring lines in the East Field, and her name in ink on a legal document, and his voice in a crowded room saying my wife like a title, like a fact, like a choice. It was new, it was real, and it had her name on it. That, Margaret Caldwell Brooks decided, standing in the hallway of the house she had quietly saved and openly reclaimed, was everything she had ever needed it to be. The day Nathaniel Brooks thought he was ending her story was, in the end, the day she finally began writing her own, and she intended to fill every page.